Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
I had a whole bunch of people send me the story out of Ohio regarding General Motors and the tax incentives in the plant. And this is one of those crazy stories, but, it makes you think. And you also wonder about these deals that are made at the top levels by government officials and big corporations. And oftentimes the people behind these deals are well-meaning, which I'm trying to say is they mean well, but then they just kind of screw things up. And then you wonder, who's to blame? So here's the deal out of the Associated Press. Ohio may force General Motors to repay $60 million after it shut down the Lordstown plant. Now, you may have heard about this as a place in Ohio called Lordstown. And in Lordstown was a plant run by General Motors. And a few years ago, General Motors announced that they were going to shut down that plant. And I believe they actually even sold the plant. And that caused some problems down there because there were a lot of people who worked at the plant. And some people seem to remember that, wait a second, wasn't there a time when General Motors was granted all kinds of tax breaks in exchange for running this plant here? So Ohio officials are now considering forcing General Motors to repay $60 million in public incentives because they closed the massive assembly plant near Youngstown. So there's Lordstown and there's Youngstown. At issue is an economic development deal from more than a decade ago that gave General Motors millions of dollars in tax breaks in exchange for a promise to keep the Lordstown plant operating at least through 2027. Now, I'm no mathematician, but my belief is that this year is 2020. And I seem to recall that years tend to escalate numerically, one at a time per year. So if this is 2020, that would mean next year would be 2021. So therefore, 2027 would be 7 years hence, give or take. And since we're not there yet, and the plant is now closed, that means that by definition, they are no longer operating that plant at least through 2027. So there's a disconnect, as we say. State officials notified the automaker in March the plant's closing last year violated the agreement. This is according to the Business Journal out of Youngstown, Ohio. Ohio's threat to claw back the incentives is complicated by General Motors' decision to build a new electric battery cell factory next to the site of the much larger assembly plant that it shut down in March of 2019, which was after more than 50 years of production. So the battery plant is going to create 1,100 jobs, but GM had employed 4,500 workers at the assembly plant when they were running 3 shifts. And of course, they weren't always running 3 shifts, I don't believe there. That was one of the big debates about whether they were running at full capacity or so on. GM also agreed to loan $40 million to a startup company that bought its closed assembly plant and wants to make electric pickup trucks there. So GM spokesperson said, "We are respectfully asking the state to consider our belief that a repayment of the tax credits would be inconsistent with our significant manufacturing presence in Ohio and the Mahoning Valley." GM also responded by telling the state in a letter it should consider that the closing was the result of the small car market collapsing and how it's dealing now with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. But of course, that doesn't answer the question. Was there a contract? And if there was a contract, was it spelled out, you will do this in exchange for this? And if you got this, then you got to do what you were supposed to do. And that's one of the things that I find interesting about the story is that as I've read various versions of it, it's never quite clear if it was spelled out. If you close before 2027, you must pay this money back. And now, any good attorneys, and I know a few, would tell you that if that's what you were trying to anticipate, you'd put that in the contract. And I've taught law school classes, and I've jokingly asked students, I call on one at random and say, hey, you want to draft a legally binding contract. What do you title it? What do you call it? What are the words you put across the top in all caps? And they say things like, agreement, understanding of the parties. And I go, why don't you call it legally binding contract? And of course, this is a thought exercise because I've never seen a document entitled legally binding contract. And there's a reason for it. Is that both sides negotiating a contract want to push the most onerous provisions on their opponent while keeping wiggle room on themselves. And they think that they're being clever by doing that, while the other side's trying to do the exact same thing. So both sides quite often enter into a contract thinking, I'm going to try to hold the other guy to it, but I need an out if I need an out. So if I need an out, I'll give myself a little escape room here. And so neither side wants to call it a legally binding contract. So the attorneys in my audience, I urge you, one of you, to draft a contract one day that actually is entitled legally binding contract and ask someone to sign it. And if they say, no, I won't sign it, go, why not? Weren't you expecting it to be legally binding and a contract? So I don't know what this agreement looks like with respect to the agreement between General Motors and Ohio. And I also don't know what exactly the incentives were they got. I don't know if there were tax breaks or tax deferrals or actual money. I don't know. I've heard some crazy things that have been offered up by municipalities trying to land things like stadiums. So for instance, Little Caesars Arena in Detroit that just got built not too long ago in the grand scheme of things was given all kinds of incentives by the city of Detroit to bring that into the city of Detroit. And now there's a great argument as to why that's good for Detroit, because there was a point in time when the Pistons played in Auburn Hills and the Detroit Lions played in Pontiac. And, people are like, why don't they play in Detroit? Well, of course, the Lions, where they play might not matter all that much because what they're playing ain't really football, but it's another story altogether. But the Little Caesars Arena now being downtown will be a good thing for Detroit. But the question always is, but will it be worth what the city gave them to bring them down there? And so here, they keep putting the number $60 million on what General Motors was incentivized with to have a plant up and running in Lordstown through 2027. Through 2027. And like I said, they're 7 years short of that. And so then the question is, do they have to give some money back? Or do they have to pay some money they wouldn't have had to pay otherwise? Or are these things even spelled out in the agreement? Now, I suspect they are. And I'm trying to remember, I've been racking my brain as I've been talking, whether or not I ever did a video about the UAW's first contract. The first contract with the United Auto Workers and General Motors was a single page, one piece of paper, one front side, that's it, one side of a single piece of paper, the entire contract. And I've taught Michigan history, so I've often, when I teach the class, I hand it out. So let's read the first contract between the UAW and General Motors. It's a fascinating historical exercise to do that, to understand that there was that important of an agreement that was created with a single piece of paper, one-page document. And the interesting thing is that it wasn't titled legally binding contract, but it did accomplish its purpose. And so I don't know what the agreements look like between a municipality and a big three automaker when they come to all kinds of agreements regarding tax payments and tax deferrals and tax forgiveness and all that. I don't know what it looks like, whether it's 100 pages or 20 pages, or if it's a letter of understanding or a memorandum of agreement. I don't know. But it certainly makes you wonder. And when you watch these situations where municipalities are beating each other up, trying to land a stadium, for instance, or trying to land the headquarters for a corporation or something, and you see the huge bonuses they're offering, we'll pay you, come here, we'll pay you. And don't get me wrong, I understand the concept behind it. And if a plant comes in and creates thousands and thousands of jobs, yeah, that's huge for the community, it's huge for the state, it's huge for everything. But when you put on the other side that somebody's giving up $60 million, then you ask yourself, is this worth this? And these things aren't always apples to apples comparisons. So it's an interesting question here, because they're saying now that they're considering it. They're considering it. And what I'm wondering about most here, is it simply a political issue? In other words, do the people in Ohio have a legal right where they can simply say, you owe us some money, pay us? And if necessary, take them to court and win. If they have that strong of a position, why do they say they are simply considering it? Because General Motors sold the plant. So reopening that plant is gone. That's a done deal. That cannot happen. That ship has sailed. That horse has left the barn. That cliche has cliched, okay? But they said, well, but we're opening up the electric battery place, the battery plant. That's going to create 1,100 jobs. The question is what's happening behind the scenes might possibly be that GM's going to say, well, if you make us pay back that money, we may have to move these jobs elsewhere. But then the question becomes, are these 1,100 jobs worth the 4,500 jobs that they had before? And so it might simply be a big political issue, simply a matter of who's going to do what in an attempt to make it look like everybody's getting the best deal here for their constituents. And the constituents of Ohio, of course, are the people who live there. And the constituents of General Motors are the executives and the stockholders who, quite frankly, don't care so much where their money is made so long as the money is, in fact, made. So that's the story. Ohio may force General Motors to repay $60 million after it shut down its Lordstown plant. And what is most surprising to me about this entire story is they shut the plant down over a year ago. Over a year ago. And right now it's hitting the news. Now, I assure you, knowing what I know about how people are, that there have been people in Ohio that the moment they announced they're going to shut the plant down, there had to have been people saying, wait, what about the $60 million sweetheart deal we gave these guys? What about that? So I'm curious to know why it took from their announcement they're shutting the plant, to them shutting the plant, to them selling the plant, to like another year going by before somebody goes, hey, maybe we want that money back. Really? I mean, if I misplaced $60 million or thought I had, I think I'd go looking for it before I let a year and a half go by. So that might just be me. So there you go. Ohio may force GM to repay $60 million after it shut down Lordstown plant a year and a half ago. Questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Ain't nobody dope as me. I wash my hands incessantly.